So good afternoon and welcome. My name is Lisa Burke. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Judiciary's Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement Program Officer, and I'm joined by my colleague, Vanessa Ravanelli, who is the Chief of Litigant Services and Outreach. Our session today is on the reduction and elimination of bias. And to start off our session, I'm going to turn to Vanessa, who's going to do a brief presentation on the judiciary's Access and Fairness Program, which is one significant element in the judiciary's longstanding 40-year history in systemic efforts to reduce bias and eliminate barriers to the court. So I'll turn to you, Van.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to try and share my screen, and hopefully it will work for me. Can you see it, Lisa?
All good.
Okay. So good evening, and thank you all so much for signing up to be volunteers with us. This evening, I'm going to start off talking about access and fairness, ensuring an open door to justice. As Lisa said, my name is Vanessa Ravanelli. I use the pronouns of she and her. I'm the Chief of Litigant Services and Outreach, and I am also part of the Office of Communications and Community Relations at the Administrative Office of the Courts. One of my roles is to serve as staff to the Supreme Court Advisory Access, and also to serve as the central office liaison for the Judiciary's Ombudsman Program. So it's nice to start presentations off with our mission statement. You may already be familiar with it, but it doesn't hurt to remind ourselves why we do what we do and why it's so important. Also, I like to look at the 4 core values. I'm sure you're familiar with these as well, and if not, you certainly will be by the time this training is over. And I'm sure you use these values every day, you live them every day, but how often do you constantly think about them, like in your consciousness? Our core values are a good place to start when we're talking about the concept of access and fairness. And those core values are independence, integrity, fairness, and quality service. This Chief Justice Ravner quote is a great summary of what access and fairness is all about. Notice that it also encompasses our mission and our core values. That's who we are, and that's what we do. It's as simple as that. And as volunteers, you are a part of who we are. The chief has also said that the framework of our Access and Fairness Program will shape the future of our court system for the next quarter century and beyond. So you know just how important this is to him. It is equally important to Judge Grant, who chairs the advisory committee and is committed to embedding the principles of access and fairness into every part of our court system. So what can you do? Well, this is where you come in. So this brief presentation is meant to give you a reminder of the principles of access and fairness and why they're important, but it's also to call to action in terms of your very important role to promote, model, support the principles as a court volunteer. You can show that you understand and live the principles of access and fairness in our courts. You, as a judiciary volunteer, provide access and fairness to our court users. Both the judiciary and the world has gone through quite a few changes since the pandemic, noted with the technology issues we had today with getting you into this room. In fact, in some ways, fundamentally, it's changed how we do business in general and communicate with court users. So this is a time to look at access and fairness in our current, very different court environment. This is the logo that we use for access and fairness. We must remain an open door to justice, regardless of what challenges the court user might face, and regardless of the challenges our court might face. So it's up to us to remove barriers, physical or otherwise, so that people can get the help that they need. You can see this in the way that we provide ADA accommodations, interpreting services, and one-on-one help in our resource centers, but access and fairness goes much further than that. As you know, when people come to the court, they do so because they need help. And of course, we have been providing valuable services to the public since our modern court system was created. But the thing about access and fairness is that it's about the court user's perspective. It's about the court user's experience in the court. Court users must trust that they can come to us for help, regardless of who they are. This is what we call trust and confidence in the courts. By way of reminder, the concept of procedural fairness, which we all call access and fairness, has these four principles: respect, voice, neutrality, and trust. These principles should be easy for us to understand because we have experience being customers. So we know what it feels like when we're being treated appropriately or not appropriately. We know when we've been treated with respect, and we know when we have not. And I can assure you that our court users know that as well. They want to be treated with dignity and respect, to be heard, to be reassured that we will treat their court matter impartially with no bias, and that they can trust in the system itself, regardless of the outcome. So during the post-pandemic, we've had to kind of change the way what we need to ensure an open door to access. So one, remote access. We figured out ways to connect court users remotely, whether in providing basic customer service or in court events. We now have JEDs for uploading court forms and documents, an expanded ability to plead by mail, pay fines online in municipal court, and the ability to hold routine conferences and hearings by phone. Language access. We, of course, have bilingual staff, court interpreters, and other tools that help in communicating with court users who don't speak English. And of course, the digital divide. What about those individuals that don't have any access online and have additional needs and challenges? Well, we have divisional staff in each vicinage, as well as ombudsmen and their staff, who can help court users in ways that are new and different. So what have we learned during these challenging times? Well, first, we've learned that the court users come to us because they need our help in matters vitally important to them. Unfortunately, matters have been made more difficult by the pandemic and resulting in delays in courts and the legal system. And unfortunately, in some areas, it still lags. Second, that our organization can continue to develop technology to increase our effectiveness. So we should become familiar with how that technology can help us help our court users. And finally, we mustn't forget that technology tools are not the solution for every court user. We must also be ready to be innovative in other ways to help those who face those barriers, such as limited English proficiency, illiteracy, or lack of online access. So hopefully with that, you can see how you fit right in with providing that access to our court users. That is all I have to say for this portion. Right now, I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa, who's going to discuss accessible and inclusive communication principles and the elimination of bias. Thank you so much for listening. Lisa?
Thank you. And thank you for setting the foundation for us for this elimination of bias segment. So to proceed, I'm also going to share a PowerPoint just to have us kind of have a guide to walk us through. So one of the things that we know about elimination of bias, or the steps towards that, the reduction of bias, is that it requires daily commitment and sustained attention to the way that we think, speak, and make decisions. So as we walk through this brief program, I invite you to think about the specific context in which you provide such meaningful volunteer service to the court and the way that you contribute to the administration of justice, and how the principles that I highlight in this brief presentation intersect with that volunteer service. So when I use the term bias, I'm referencing prejudgments. We are probably most familiar with those that are against a thing, person, or group, but biases also can be in favor of a thing, person, or group. And favorable biases can actually be just as harmful to the people or thing or group outside the favor as those biases against a thing, person, or group are. So whether favorable or unfavorable, biases can be structural, explicit, or implicit. The bottom line is that they are prejudgments, whether in a positive or negative way. And when I use the term bias in this instance, I'm not using it as a synonym for discrimination. To me, discrimination is actually a particular expression of bias, but not all bias are or I should say that not all expressions of bias actually rise to the legal definition of discrimination, but are nonetheless just as harmful, if not more harmful. So when we talk about structural bias, we talk about really systems or institutions within society. When we talk about a specific structural bias like institutional racism, we talk about the ways in which the practices of a system, an institution, or an organization in society replicate those racialized outcomes or those racist effects. Sometimes, oftentimes in current day, without intending to, but nonetheless still doing. So how do we recognize structural bias or an institutionalism? One way might be through embedded disparities, processes that simply treat different people differently or that treat similarly situated people differently. Then there are those where seemingly neutral processes still have a disparate impact because of factors external to an organization. And then there are operations that treat different groups differently. How does structural bias occur and how does it become institutionalized? Really, three main ways. We have the legacy of legislated second-class citizenship, or in the case of the United States, actual legislated non-personhood. We have the default position, quote, we've always done it this way, closed quote. And then lastly, we have the reality that organizations consist of human beings and all human beings have bias. So we're going to move from structural bias to personal bias, which exists in two main categories: explicit bias and implicit or unconscious bias. Explicit bias is the bias that we know we have, and we know that it is affecting our ability to be objective, neutral, and impartial. Most people's biases are not explicit, but the most egregious forms of bias tend to be explicit. Common examples we can think of include white supremacy and anti-Semitism. People with explicit biases usually are proud of their views and often try to recruit others to their perspective. By contrast, implicit or unconscious bias is the bias that functions in our mind, but we're not aware of it when it's functioning, yet it still impacts our ability to be neutral, fair, and impartial. We know, and we are using implicit and unconscious as synonyms in this case, that while explicit biases are the biases we're aware of, implicit biases are the ones that happen at the implicit or unconscious level. We know, in fact, that most thought processes are at the unconscious level, right? Or at the implicit associational thinking dimension. In and of itself, implicit associational thinking is not biased. It is a cognitive efficiency, as scientists describe it. It's neither good nor bad. And as a cognitive efficiency, we might say in most instances, it's perfectly fine. The challenge is when we move from an implicit association to an implicit assumption that does not actually line up with the facts in a specific instance. So because our implicit biases function unconsciously, they affect our ability to be neutral or impartial or objective without us knowing it. But if we are able to become more attuned to our implicit associations and the implicit assumptions that we draw, we can slow down the effects of implicit associational thinking and the effects of implicit bias in our thought processes and our decision making. So we all have implicit biases. We all act in implicitly biased ways at times. Judges, lawyers, doctors, jurors, teachers, nurses, EMTs, police officers, faith-based leaders, young people, not so young people. We all do, because we all have that brain mapping, that cognitive efficiency called implicit associational thinking. So if I have implicit biases, and we all do, does it really matter? Like, doesn't mine cancel out yours and yours cancel out mine? Well, actually, no, because there are some implicit associations that are so prevalent that yours and mine combine and actually exacerbate one another's. And it does matter, and there is something we all can do. Recognizing the connection between implicit associations and implicit assumptions, and between implicit assumptions and implicit bias is a first step. It's the awareness step, and it's a necessary step. Routinely pausing to self-evaluate our decision-making is an essential second step and an essential ongoing step. So I ask you to pause and to think about, and you may make note of this question for yourself. Can we identify some implicit associations or implicit assumptions that could come up in the context of the volunteer programs in which you serve? I certainly welcome you if you have some immediate thoughts to drop those in the chat. But more importantly, I ask you to think about this as a takeaway question. I'm going to stop the screen share there and actually turn us to a brief video, which is going to invite us to think about this with some more specificity. It is a 2-minute, less than 2-minute actually, Procter & Gamble public service announcement titled The Look. I will say that it deals with issues of anti-Black racism and microaggressions, so I want to give that content warning. We each come to viewing things like this through the lenses of our own identities and experiences. So we will each have very different experiences, and I want to acknowledge and hold space for those for whom this is going to be uncomfortable because it is representative of their own lived experience or the lived experience of their loved ones. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show the video, and then I'm going to welcome you if you have thoughts and observations you either want to share aloud or via the chat to please do so. And we will circle back in a minute. Bear with me 1 second just to make sure that this queues up correctly. There we go. There's no narration. It is just the visuals. So I would draw your attention.
All rise.
So I certainly invite you to share any thoughts and reactions you have in the chat, or if you want to unmute and share here. In a longer program, we would actually spend quite a bit of time unpacking the content, people's observations, people's feelings about what they observed. While we will not be able to do that in today's session, especially since we're ensuring that we get all of the content in despite the challenge of the delayed start with the technology issue, I do want to acknowledge that people are likely feeling very heavy observations and feelings about the video. And I don't want to seem to be diluting or bypassing that in any way. So while we continue to acknowledge people's thoughts and observations, let me add some context for those who are not as familiar with what this intends to highlight. So in addition to demonstrating just a few select visuals over the course of a day of anti-Black microaggressions expressed through the look, or what some people call the gaze, G-A-Z-E, this film also advances our awareness of how microaggressions function in our society. And I have a few that are very common occurrences in the administration of justice, the practice of law, the delivery of court services. We've heard these relayed to us many times, so I just am going to speak them as illustrations. This is by no way an exhaustive list. It is really just a very tip of the iceberg illustration. And I ask you to think about whether you've heard these things said. But you have such a pretty face, said to a woman who's overweight. Only attorneys are allowed into the well or past the bar, to a Black woman who is the founder of a prominent defense firm. No, no, no. Let me tell you how it is, said by a male colleague to the only female colleague in the room. Where do you come from? Said to somebody with a Latino surname who in fact was born in the South Bronx. You speak English so well, said to somebody of South Asian heritage who in fact was schooled exclusively in London and in New York. You are married, said to somebody who navigates the world in a wheelchair. These are but a few examples of microaggressions, something that's defined by Dr. Darrell Wing Su as brief, everyday exchanges that send denigrating messages to certain individuals because of their group membership. People sometimes ask, are people who exercise microaggressions bad people? Are they racist, sexist, or homophobic? The quick answer is that we may or we may not be. And yes, I switched that from they to we, because it's not the microaggression that's the measure. And all of us at times express microaggressions, either through speech or body language. And in some instances, we may even find ourselves in spaces where the environment includes microaggressive monuments or tributes and things of the sort. So most microaggressions come from good people with good intentions. In fact, many are expressed from the framework of thinking that we are paying a person a compliment. So while we may be well-intentioned and most likely are not aware of the negative impact of our words or behaviors, being good people and having good intentions is not the measure, and it's not a pass. We know that the impact of microaggressions is real and cumulative, and the effect of microaggressions compound, including on people's mental and physical health and overall well-being. If that is not something you're very aware of, you might be interested in some of the literature in the area of health outcomes that further support that. One of the most common forms of microaggressions is microinvalidations, which we actually saw demonstrated in the film. The notion of you don't belong here, or your presence here is tentative and conditional, and at any point can be retracted. So another discussion and reflection point I'll offer and invite you to consider as a takeaway is, can we identify some potential microaggressions that could occur in the context of court volunteer programs? And I invite you to think about that not only in relation to the people, the court users whom we serve, but even the people with whom we serve. So the peers, our colleagues. Another thing that I invite you to think about is the power and impact of language, both the language we use and the language we hear. I know that in many case management contexts, court volunteers come into frequent contact with paperwork, with reports that describe people, describe situations, or some may be involved in the writing of reports or of updates. So thinking meaningful about the power of language and the image that we form in our head, the implicit association and the implicit assumption that we can draw based on ways that people are described. The word choice. So for example, whether someone's described as aggressive as opposed to assertive, whether they're described as deficient versus different, whether they're described as difficult versus just not compliant, whether they're described as confident or self-assured versus arrogant, as outspoken versus articulate. When we read the media and we read about an alleged crime, which crimes get their story told without the picture of the alleged perpetrator? And when is the picture of the alleged perpetrator the actual lead? What statements get classified as wrong versus incorrect or imprecise, or not true versus not accurate? What events get reported as assemblies or demonstrations or protests versus riots? And what acts get described as property damage versus looting? As we conclude our time together today, I ask you to think about further engaging in the work of eliminating bias and reducing barriers in both the personal dimension and the professional. I share with you a tool that I use because I think that introspection is key in further highlighting the implicit associations my mind engages in and the implicit assumptions I draw, so as to reduce the effect of implicit bias in my decision-making process. So I ask myself, why do I think what I think? Is my thought based in fact? Is my view based on fact-specific knowledge or an implicit association? Are my decisions guided by actual facts or implicit associations? And I can assure you that this thought funnel that as what I've termed it, can apply to both big business professional decisions, but also to personal ones. Like whether or not I stay in a conversation with somebody new that's come up to the group that I'm speaking with at a professional networking event. So I invite you to think about, what will you add to your individual elimination of bias roadmap? I invite you to think about these things in relation to the people with whom we work shoulder to shoulder, those peer-colleague relationships, the people we manage, supervise, and mentor, the people whose lives we impact through the decisions we propose, areas for which we're responsible, and the public whom we all serve, even the people in the public that we never see, but whose impression of the quality of justice in New Jersey is based on what they hear from others who have come in contact with the legal system. So the third discussion and reflection point is this: how can we apply the concepts briefly explored today to the context of our ongoing volunteering with the New Jersey courts? In closing, I'd like to share this reflection in my own words. The work of eliminating bias belongs to us all. It's a daily undertaking, and it requires us to look at the same time, both internally and externally. So whether we are white and addressing racial and ethnic bias, heterosexual and addressing anti-LGBTQ+ bias, cisgender and addressing anti-transgender bias, able-bodied and addressing disability bias, we owe it to ourselves, to each other, and to the people we serve to embed this work in our daily living and to center it in our daily work. On behalf of Vanessa and I would sincerely like to thank you for choosing to be with us in this session. Whether you are here with us in real time or you'll be viewing this via the recording, we really appreciate your commitment to your volunteer service with the New Jersey courts and to continuing to grow your awareness and tools for advancing the reduction of bias in the legal system. That concludes our session here, and I believe next you are on to the end note. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you all.